Hello, and welcome to the final lecture on Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Today is a major lecture in which we shall summarize many of the key themes that we've already raised in our ongoing conversation about this important and influential text. And we'll also look at the passages that conclude some of the passages towards the end of the novel. In addition, we'll be talking about the work of literary critic Ian Watt in his pioneering description of early novels from his text, The Rise of the Novel. In the course of today's lesson, we shall hear from Professor Bill Kohlbrenner and Dr. Kara Glatt regarding some of the larger questions of how this text, Robinson Crusoe, fits into your studies of English literature and the trajectory or the evolution of English from earlier forms into forms that you recognize more widely. To review, this text is an Enlightenment text. It fits into the early 18th century text that you have been studying for the last in the last period. What does it mean to be an Enlightenment text? Well, this text is one that tries to balance several key ideas that we have been talking about for the last several weeks. To review, it is a text that tries to balance between an entertainment or amusement, a value that an emphasis on interest in an unusual or adventurous tale, and a tale that has a kind of moral instruction. We'll be returning to that again today. Likewise, it is one that tries to balance between what one man's life, the exemplary role of a single individual, and the general purpose. That has been one of the key themes throughout our studies of English literature, British literature throughout the course. The balance between the society, the collective on one hand, and the private individual on the other hand. To be sure, the Enlightenment places a great deal of influence, a great deal of emphasis on the individual, but the individual as a perspective or a specimen of a larger class of people. Every individual, not just the rich and not just the royal, can be a discoverer, can be a philosopher, can be intelligent. And so the rise of the novel is accompanied by a growing emphasis on individuals, the individual sphere, the private sphere, but the private sphere as representative, as reflective of rational thought, on the rights of all people, on the perspectives on what people can know. Now, of course, this is still privileged. When they say all people, they really mean white men, especially British white men. Let's keep that in mind, and we'll see that today in the treatment of Friday. And the other key theme that I want to remind you of, I have raised this already, but is how the novel participates in or reflects some of these larger changes happening in society, with growing literacy, with democratizing and proliferating enlightenment. The novel becomes a key genre, a key form that both reflects and participates in these changes of the Enlightenment era. Why fiction? Why this novel form that both celebrates and is created, both celebrates the middle station that Crusoe comes from, is created by people of that station, and is about their lives, will be the key focus of today's class. You are familiar with many of these fundamental terms from your previous studies in years past. Now we can apply them at a more sophisticated, complex level. Defoe, as I've already said, is pertinent to us because, well, for many reasons. He's a fascinating figure, both fascinating and sometimes very boring, quite tiresome. He is someone who is very familiar with extreme social isolation. But this text is a novelist, and this is another point that I will put to my colleagues, and you'll hear about it in another minute or two, who represent an entire society. Defoe is entirely alone on his island, and yet comes to be a kind of emblem of Englishness. So here is a solitary, an ordinary person as representative of an entire way of being. What we have also talked about, and this is new for today, is how the plot of the novel, what happens to Crusoe, is not itself crucial. There was a spoiler already on that frontispiece we looked at last week, the frontispiece, the title page, that tells you that Crusoe will be shipwrecked and ultimately delivered, saved from the island. And so what happens to him, people are not reading for the plot in the sense of finding out what happens, but it's the very notion of plot. I want to make a distinction here, not about the plot as the end, the conclusion, what happens to him, but the very idea of plottedness, of shape and design on a life. One way we can think about this, and we talked about this in the previous class, so this, although this is a new slide, it refers to material we've already discussed, is the tension between a natural and providential design of one's life. What shapes or what patterns, what structures the course of one's own personal experience? Is it natural, arbitrary, chaotic, or is it providential, guided by a divine hand? In the words of Jewish philosophers, hashgachat pratit, there is something actually shaping and guiding me throughout. This idea of fate, just what happens, and destiny, this was meant to happen, is apparent very early in this text. These were lines that we didn't flag as we went over them, but these ideas were already part of our conversation. Crusoe writes in his retrospective account, talking about his departure from his father, his betrayal of his world. If I was not very easy and happy in the world, it must be my mere fate or fault that must hinder it. I had a comfortable station, but it must be my mere fate or fault that must hinder it. Fate, what happens, or fault, a kind of sin. My ill fate, Crusoe says, pushed me on now with an obstinacy that nothing could resist. There's some greater power that's pushing me on. And though I had several times loud calls from my reason and my more composed judgment to go home, that I had no power to do it. Many key lines in that quotation. Fate, reason, which is trying to call him back from, and reason and judgment calling him back from his obstinacy, and no power. There's some greater power pushing him on. But as was always my fate to choose for the worst, he says actually, and that's one in chapter 2. This tension or this opposition between things just randomly happening or happening of his own accord by his own power, or providence, divine plan, God's hand acting in the smallest details of our lives, is there in that scene of the germs, those seeds, those kernels of corn that he unwittingly sows, and then thinks he sees as evidence of God's hand. And this happens throughout. Why does he end up on this island? Is it as punishment for his sin? Is he delivered in a way that our souls or Christians can be delivered, salvation from this island? The island is a place both of it's in some sense a Garden of Eden, but also is a kind of hell, a purgatory, if you remember from your studies of Christian theology, a place where you're held and you can go either way, up to heaven or down to hell. Let's look at some new ideas. I just want to mention two more. I want to mention something that will come up right now in the conversation with Dr. Glass, and then we'll discuss Kolbrenner in more general terms. Ian Watt's mid-20th century text, Rise of the Novel, an academic text, a classic of literary criticism that relies very heavily on Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and another text that we will soon encounter, Pamela by Richardson, that tries to give an account of what shapes early English fiction. There are several hallmarks that Professor Watt, that Ian Watt talks about in this still influential work. Watt talks about the focus on the individual, something that I just mentioned again. Here's here's a quotation from Watt's work. Vast transformation of Western civilization since the Renaissance, which has replaced the unified world picture of the Middle Ages with another very different one, which presents us essentially with a developing but unplanned aggregate of particular individuals having particular experiences at particular times in particular places. The novel is marked by this turn from a portrait of society on the whole, everyone in it is kind of in a unified world with a coherent and unchanging rigid structure, to an aggregate, an assemblage of different individuals who are all doing different things, having particular experiences, and that focus on the particular is key. Another key part of this is the formal realism. This is a term that I mentioned to you already, and here it is in its genesis, its coinage by Watt. What is formal realism? It's the technique, or as he calls it, narrative procedures, what writers can do. And they do it most commonly in the novel, so often in novel, and rarely in other literary genres. I'm quoting now from what's on the screen, that these procedures may be regarded as typical of the form itself. They may be characteristic or constitutive, defining of the novel itself. What are they? The premise or primary convention, that the novel is a full and authentic report of human experience, that this is someone's life. To create that sense, it must offer readers such details of the story as the individuality of the actors is concerned. Characters have to be individuated, given backstories, given birth dates, later on, given a kind of appearance, dress, particular habits of behavior. Those are the elements of formal realism. One more element of formal realism, and then I'm going to go to Dr. Glad, and then I'll come back to this. I'll come back to that third bullet point, the emphasis on economy, a separate point that I'll talk about in connection with Man Friday, the end of the novel. Formal realism, Watt writes in chapter 1, here's the full quotation that I excerpted in the previous slide, that these narrative procedures, and they're used so often by Defoe and the next author that we'll encounter, Samuel Richardson, that this is a life. And therefore, the author has to do something, has to convince us that these are individuals, real people, not types, but real people who lived at particular times and places of their actions. And at the end of this quotation, details which are presented through a more largely referential use of language than is common in other literary forms. Not metaphorical, but referential, referring to specific times and places, referring to specific events, dates, and occasions, incidents. Now, all of this creates a kind of pressure on the text to balance itself between the exemplary, the instructive, the moral, that's all typology, how Crusoe represents some narrative or some story, some experience that might matter and instruct the rest of us, and the individual, what is unique to him. That tension between the exemplary, the instructive, the didactic, what is represented about this person and what is unique to them, that might interest me as precisely because it's different. The sameness that the sameness between the character and the reader, the resemblance, and the difference goes back to Enlightenment thought. It was there in It was there, if you noticed, in what Addison said about Locke's interpretation of wit. It is there in the very structure of Enlightenment thought, that what I think could occur to you if you were intelligent or rational enough, that our thought could all be analyzed critically. My thoughts are unique to me, but they're ones that could occur to you, and the balance between the public and the individual. All of that is situated in this new era of novels, of this new form, this emerging form that is the successor to previous forms, epics, Renaissance drama, and will become the gateway, become the dominant form of the next 200 years of literature. And here it is not a term that Defoe ever was familiar with, but it is emerging at the time. I'm going now to transfer to the conversation with Dr. Glatt, and you will have a chance to hear her thoughts precisely about this. And there are two conversations now that I hope will add interest to the course. And we'll start, let's see, I don't know which one is which. I'm going to, excuse me, I see that the file names are nearly identical, 19047. Okay, and here is Dr. Glatt with me discussing the place of the novel. Dr. Glatt, I'm so grateful to you for sharing some of your expertise on the novel, on 18th and 19th century matters, your specialty, not mine. We're studying Defoe, Robinson Crusoe right now, a text that you know better than I do, at the very least. And I want to ask you something that fits into the larger trajectory of the course, which moves from the epic to the novel, and how the novel, this art form, produced the genre produced by members of the so-called middle station, as Crusoe's father labels himself, produced for them, and it's about them, about their own ambitions, their fantasies, their desires, their predicaments, how this very modest form of bourgeois life came to supplant the epic as the primary vehicle of literary artistry, as a vehicle of meaning and moral instruction. So what's your account of that condensing?
So first of all, for the sake of honesty, I would say my account, like I think most people teaching this material today, is highly influenced by the account of a man named Ian Watt, who in the 1950s wrote a book called The Rise of the Novel that focused heavily on Defoe, as well as Richardson and Fielding, two other authors that maybe your students are doing this semester, not sure. But so just to give credit where credit is due, he was sort of monumental in this discussion. But I mean, one of the answers, so we could approach this first from a historicist perspective, where one quite simple reason for maybe some of the shift away from more stylized and elevated subjects to the appeal to the, as they say, the middling sort, more people are reading. So more people are literate, more people have the ability to purchase novels. It's cheaper to buy novels than it had been 100 years earlier. So you suddenly have this market where there are ordinary people, or at least a wider section of the population, that might be interested. And they're going to be interested potentially in different things than somebody who's studied at Oxford and is steeped in the classics and has a sense of all of the old stories. As many of you may know, originality is not actually considered a primary value for much of literary history. So the idea of saying, I'm going to show how learned I am, I'm going to talk about these classic stories, we're going to resurrect these other themes, is very appealing. As you have a wider audience, that's not the case to the same extent. You also, I think around this period, we're also in the period known as the Enlightenment, which starts, Crusoe is 1719?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So starting in the 17th century, so those are the 1600s, and on through the 1700s, we're in a period called the Enlightenment, in which, among other things, there's more of an emphasis on the individual. The Enlightenment There are plenty of people during the Enlightenment, plenty of Enlightenment thinkers who are still religious in the conventional sense, but there's more of a turn away from the kind of mystical spirituality and towards reason, towards science. This is when the scientific method comes into currency. There's an idea of experimentation, observation, and with it, even outside of the scientific context, there's more of a sense of, what am I doing in the world? What is my role? What is the role of the individual within the community? What rights does the individual have in a state? And this is also felt in literature. The idea of saying, rather than going to themes that are maybe further from our life, and the idea of something that takes us away and distances us, let's talk about the actual conditions of life, and let's focus on individual people. Look what an individual person's perspective, his view of the world, their experiences are seen as important in a way that they wouldn't have been 100 years earlier. You also do have, in general, a rising middle class. Granted, the middle class is something that, if you ask certain historians, it's always rising. But yes, you have a kind of middle class that is literate and capable of speaking about themselves in more sophisticated ways. And so the idea that you're going to have novels that reflect that, and in addition, Defoe and Robinson Crusoe, arguably, there's continual discussion over what actually is the first English novel. Crusoe is one of the candidates. Crusoe is one of the candidates. Not everyone would agree. Pamela is another one, written some 30 years later. There's a novel called Orinoco that's written in the late 17th century. And one of the reasons, I mean, Defoe, reading Crusoe is not like reading a novel as you've experienced it before. There are elements of Crusoe that do read more like a travelogue. More like, if you read Crusoe, you sometimes get the sense, if I were shipwrecked on a desert island, I'd be able to do a much better job of it because I've read Crusoe, right? If you're looking at it from a spiritual perspective, and this was part of Defoe's idea in writing it, there was an idea of, this is how a Christian deals with spiritual struggle in the modern world, right? This is also a conversion narrative. And some of the antecedents, some of the prior texts that influence Crusoe, they're not fictional works at all. They're actually works, nonfiction works, written precisely by individuals, and mainly two categories. You have conversion narratives, so a form that's become popular in the period before Defoe is writing Robinson Crusoe, is people who will write a story about, I was a sinner, I was sinful, and these are the terrible, terrible things I've done, and then I found God, and here's how my life changed. So this is one model. And another model, this is the age of exploration. This is a period where new lands are being discovered. So the idea of people are writing travelogues about places they've been to, about these new worlds that have been discovered. So aside from any sort of literary models Defoe is following, these are, as you, again, have a more literate population who are capable of telling their own stories and have a sense that my story is worth telling. There are suddenly models of more or less ordinary people telling their stories, and this being very popular and very affecting to people. So this is some of what's going on that leads, I think, to Robinson Crusoe.
That's all very beautifully and eloquently put. Isn't Crusoe a very bizarre and anomalous forerunner of precisely that form, since it doesn't give much of a glimpse into the middling sort, the middle class? It's not about society. It's not about the relationships and the interactions that occur in the world that reflect anything that its readers would recognize. It's about one guy. It's about one individual alone. It's focused exclusively on the individual and not how the individual operates in society. Does that make it a very strange example?
And this is precisely the reason some people will say, no. This is not the first English novel. And it's a transitional text in a lot of ways. I think one of the qualities of Crusoe that still makes it sort of attractive and part of maybe this tradition, it's part of, I think, even though the plot is very unlikely, right? Not that many people get shipwrecked. I mean, this is hopefully not something we have to worry about that often. We might have to worry about other forms of sea travel these days, but not shipwreck.
Although we're all familiar now with the social isolation.
Right, certainly. But the tradition that comes to be known as literary realism, Defoe, I think, is engaging with that, or is starting this less maybe consciously than some of the later people. When you get into 19th century authors, they are really committed in a much more conscious way to the idea of what can the novel do. George Eliot specifically will talk about the home epic. So she really makes explicit this idea that the novel is the successor in many ways to the epic. Some people ask, why are Victorian novels so long? And now Victorian novels are talking about the 19th century. It wasn't because the authors were paid by the word. They weren't. It wasn't just because they had too much to say. It was an idea of saying, I want the novel to be large. I wanted to expand. I wanted to encompass multiple realms of society. I don't want to tell just one person's story. I want to tell several people's stories, maybe someone who's from the upper class, someone who's from the lower class. I want this to be as comprehensive as possible because I do think that this is just as important as a traditional epic about a great battle. Defoe isn't really there yet in terms of that form of realism.
Yeah.
But
it's not a panoramic view of a society.
Right, he's not interested in that. He's not interested in saying, oh, this is a plot, like it could happen. This is the kind of thing that ordinary people go through all the time. But he takes a different approach. We, I think, take for granted sometimes that, well, of course, you write with a lot of detail. Anyone who's in a creative writing class today, the idea is, well, describe this. Give us more of a sense of what this is. That was not taken for granted.
Yeah, that's the ghost of Ian Watt walking among us.
Right. That was not taken for granted in earlier forms, where sometimes you read even comparatively sophisticated works and novels and you realize, I don't really know what this character looks like. I don't really know what this character's house looks like. Even Jane Austen, who in most ways is much more sophisticated, I would say, than Defoe, critics have pointed out, we often don't really get, you have these marriageable women. We don't really get a sense of what they look like most of the time. It's very odd. And certainly if you look even at earlier types of narrative, think even of something like biblical narrative to go all the way back, it doesn't have the same kind of descriptive priorities that we've come to. The
richness of the tale. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that we've come to take for granted. And I think so that alone, the idea that, and frankly, I think for us, because we're now at a later point, some of it, maybe there are times where we say, we could do without such a detailed description of how he built his winter palace and his summer palace. But just the idea that you would expend that kind of attention to one person's life, and one person who, by the way, is not a god, is not an epic hero. So we might look at it and say, well, this is still a pretty dramatic story. This is a guy who got shipwrecked and he has all these adventures and he's got period in slavery. And then this is very dramatic.
He's just a small man. He's an ordinary small man. Right, and for him to be the representative of English society,
just the idea that he's not a lord. He's not particularly wealthy. And he's somebody who is not an epic figure. He's not, if you look at Shakespeare's plays, right, almost everybody, these are stories that are taken from somewhere else. These are the histories, these are historical figures, these are mythological figures, even if they're not real. This is the king of so-and-so, the duke of so-and-so. You did, of course, in Shakespeare have the lower sort as well, but you didn't have that middle group. You didn't really have that middle group of life. So just the idea, and by the way, just the fact that you have passages in Crusoe that are not directly related to the shipwreck. Someone might say, where does the plot of Crusoe start? If you wanted, you could start on the ship and have him shipwrecked. First scene, I was shipwrecked. Here's what I did. Instead, there is some...
And I was rescued, and that's all on the frontispiece.
Right.
I was shipwrecked. I was rescued. I came home. And it's there. There's a plot spoiler even before you begin reading, which tells you the plot is not the emphasis.
Right. And I think that as well, the idea of saying, beyond even the frontispiece, I wasn't even thinking of the fact that there's a spoiler right there. The fact that we are talking about, and here's who my father was. And not because his father is particularly important. Not, my father was Poseidon, god of the sea.
I was thinking exactly that. And I love the catalog.
Really?
In bringing this, in wrapping this up, I think what you're bringing up is crucial for us, for our students, to think of that catalog of characters that we've come to know. as readers and our students have become familiar with from someone like Odysseus, people who have gods as their parents,
Right.
who have, you know, not just epic narrative, but are epic in their character through the dramatic figures of Shakespeare and of Milton, and then to this very humble, modest, ordinary individual who is somehow our representative if we were alone in the world, and how the novel tries to capture that. And there's a major shift there, and there is that scope of character and that scope of narrative is what we are trying to convey to the students, and to think about them comparatively, to see both the linkages, but also to see how different they are. And then there'll be other figures later on. I just want to let you finish up with what you were saying. If you want to get just his story can be telescoped into just a few lines.
Right.
And the shipwreck is somehow, it recedes further and further into background as he becomes lord and king over his island of one, and colonialist and slave runner.
Yes.
How are the middle class, this new emerging middling sword, how are they meant to identify with someone like this? Yes, he comes from the same background and he's got the same life story and before and after. Is this just a fantasy of what my life would be like if I could escape from my ordinary, plebeian, conventional and boring life in England?
I think this maybe leads into some of the other aims of the novel. I mean, I think one way that Crusoe in some ways does harken back to earlier texts, maybe kind of allegorical writing. In some ways, you know, there's a medieval text called Everyman, where the idea is, and then there are multiple texts where you have a character, whether it's called Everyman or not. The character is supposed to be, I represent everyone. We're not worried about characterization. Now with Crusoe, we are worried about characterization, but there's still a level in which I think he's supposed to be an aspiration of what the average English gentleman can do, or English, middle class guy can do. And also I think there's a process in Crusoe of becoming, in a sense, Englishized, and anglicized as well, in a Christian sense. Even the fact that we find out that his name was changed, right? That he comes from a Dutch family, and you say, well, no, now this is our name. What you get really in Crusoe creating his own island, I don't think it's so much, I mean, he is pretty clear in saying, you know, this was a mistake, I should have stayed home. My father was actually smarter in telling me to, you know, not go off adventuring. I wouldn't have had to suffer all of these things. And, you know, he does spend if we think the last few weeks of that, he does spend, 20 some odd years all by himself. And when he first sees a footprint, you know, instead of saying, thank God there are people, he decides to hide for like 2 more years after that. This is not like a great story of an island paradise, but I think the fact that he's able to construct a kind of micro Britain, and that you've moved away from society, and you're able to say, now I can reconstruct it anew, but not under radically different terms. Even when it seems silly, going to basically be the ideal Englishman, and I'm going to have my colonists, and I'm going to, I have my inferiors, and we have a hierarchy, and I'm lord of my island, and I have a summer home and a winter home. It's a way of expressing, I think, the aspirations of the middle class. And in a time when maybe it wouldn't be, if you were telling the story of someone living at home, maybe it's not so easy to see how that happens. You have what's sort of a fantasy, but not quite, of how the good old English character, the English Protestant character, can lead to a social rise and can lead to the construction of society.
And vanquishing his natural circumstances, controlling it, as well as the darker races as well, controlling them too.
Right, of course.
All right. Thank you, Kara. You've been very generous.
Thank you for having me.
All right, anytime.
All right.
I am grateful to Dr. Glad for sharing her wealth of ideas, her enthusiasm and erudition with us. To flag a few elements that she discussed. She spoke about the techniques of formal realism, how Defoe gives Crusoe a backstory. He doesn't begin with the shipwreck, begins with his family, which we discussed. Then there are a few chapters which we did not read, which situates him in a specific economic world, which we shall turn to momentarily, a world marked by colonialism, travel for profit, and slavery. There's also the element that she raised that this text, and this is from Dr. Shapiro, who is an expert in this matters and shared her knowledge with me, but declined to be online with you. The exemplariness of Defoe's life, and also how specifically British it is. This text was wildly popular throughout Europe in translation on the continent, and often the continent was taken to be a philosophical text about how one individual operates in isolation, the notion of natural man, and how an individual can discover all manners of practical and philosophical, and indeed also religious discoveries alone. This is the one text that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another key Enlightenment figure, and also a forerunner of Romanticism, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher and writer, said he would have his child take, if allowed, only one text, since it is sort of the world coming into being in a natural state. However, it's balanced with the specifically English interest that Kara mentioned, the colonialism and the British habits. And that is another tension in text between its universal appeal and its British character. And the text, indeed, for a long time was a European text more than what it was popular in England, but it was even more popular in its first 100 years on the continent. She spoke about those narrative techniques. That was formal realism at work. She spoke about the social world that the text came from, the growing literacy of a readership for whom it could appeal, and the rise in class. It's always been rising, as she said. Even on the 21st century, the middle class seems to be receding. Maybe we shall see a resurgence in years ahead. Yet the text said it is a mouthpiece for them, and she said how, and she also quite eloquently situated Robinson Crusoe as a successor to that chain of characters that you have come to know. In its exemplary state, Robinson Crusoe is offering a religious aspect of conversion, and something that I want to set up for you before we move ahead is the history of these religious texts, these conversion narratives. I mentioned how Defoe comes from a family of dissenters, of Protestants, and he is interested in this. The text does offer us, without question, as evidence of this narrative blueprint, the spiritual autobiography. The spiritual autobiography goes back quite some time, and the forerunner for it, or the classic example of it, is a text that was very well known from a generation or two before Crusoe, before Defoe, called Pilgrim's Progress. Here it is. What I was saying, Pilgrim's Progress, a conversion tale from 1679 that was a spiritual autobiography and an allegory. Here, Pilgrim is not a specific individual. It is quite clearly a type. It is clearly an allegorical text. This is a text that is still much read and discussed in Christian circles. And it is a text that does have a narrative. It has a story, but it is clearly one that is delivering Pilgrim to greater understanding, to salvation, to Jesus. So this idea of spiritual autobiography was one that would have been quite familiar to Defoe's readers and Defoe himself at the time. Defoe, as in all manners, is experimenting with this. However, although it has these religious elements, it also, and likewise, a part of that is the part of that is this emphasis on mundane, trivial matters, seeing religious significance in the everyday, the quotidian, the mundane. None of the spiritual elements take precedence. And this is crucial for us to understand. Watt himself writes that the Puritan influences that are evident in the text and that participate in shaping it and in the rise of the novel as a whole, religious concerns are present, Watt says, but they have no such priority of status as they do in Bunyan. This doesn't mean that these figures are not religious, but rather there is something else, something secular, to which their religious beliefs are subordinated. What is that? That is the third element of Watt's theory of the rise of the novel, which is the economic motive. I'll go back to the slides momentarily. But Watt sees the spiritual elements as yoked or joined to one of the great motivations of English man, of Western man, perhaps more generally, which is money. Robinson Crusoe for Watt becomes one of the great myths of Western civilization, like Achilles and Odysseus, like Don Quixote or Don Juan or Dr. Faustus, an emblem of the underlying desire, the foremost desires of Western man. For Crusoe, excels at what he does, which is creating profit. It is the economic motive, the economic pursuit to which everything else, his religious, spiritual inclinations, are joined. And we'll come, now let's get to this element. So the economic motive, it is profit as the plot. Sharing once again. And with this, we'll bring things to a conclusion in a few more minutes. Profit as the plot. The economic plot is mixed with religious significance. Religious elements are brought into the economic story of flourishing as a sign of divine favor, as evidence of providential favor. Profits come before profit. Profits come before relationship, before people. Robinson Crusoe, Watt writes in Rise the Novel, in the middle section in his chapter on Robinson Crusoe, has been very appropriately used by many economic theorists as their illustration of homo economicus. Just as the body politic was a symbol of communal way of life, that was Watt's theory, that it moves from talking about society as a unified whole. This is not a text that you might not know well, but Canterbury Tales, a portrait of the society as a whole, but a portrait of one man, of economic man, of the man, of individuals in their economic aspect, their individualism. This is what the text conveys. And although he's going to cite, and I will mention some of these thinkers in weeks ahead, Adam Smith, there's another one also, John Mills, these are the key economists who come up with the ideas of the free market, of capitalism. Although Defoe was living before them, he is anticipating these ideas. The concept is older than Adam Smith, is older than John Mills, that individuals come to exist in an economic system, expressing the individual in the economic system as a whole only when the individuals of the system itself have reached an advanced state of development. Robinson Crusoe is an economic individual. What allows him to be an individual is his economy. All Defoe's heroes pursue money. Let's look here on the side here. The distinctive technical, and he's very interested in his bookkeeping, keeping track of how much of his assets. He's always making lists. He's a bookkeeper at heart. That is what makes him part, as Max Weber in the Protestant ethics. This is part of what defines Crusoe. Locke's political, he also is a pure Lockean in the sense that Locke thought that contractual relationships were binding even in a state of nature. I mean, that small upper quote. Contracts are sacrosanct lock, and Crusoe acts like a good Lockean. In what sense? When others come to the island, he forced them to accept his dominion with rigid contracts, acknowledging his absolute behavior. He relates to other people, and we'll see this in Friday. This is the last part I want to present to you. Crusoe relates to Friday not as a person, but through the prism of a contract, slavery. That we are not just people to each other in relationships. We are people whose relationship to each other is defined by property. Slavery does that. The hypostasis in the bottom quote, the celebration or the elevation of the economic motive logically entails the evaluation of other modes of thought. They're still family. They're still co-religionists. There's still feeling and action. There's still love, but everything else, relationship, family, the guild, the village, all the elements of relationship that had structured previous eras are weakened, Watts says, are subordinated to the economic organization of self and society. Robinson Crusoe then, why does he leave home? Just like what takes precedence over his loyalty to father and family? The profit motive. Crusoe's original sin in that lower paragraph is really the dynamic tendency of capitalism itself, always seeking more profit. His father says, we have enough money, we're happy, we're satisfied. Crusoe, as a forerunner of the capitalist man, of as Watt calls it, homo economicus, a term that is used in economic studies, the rational man of making money. His motive is to make more. He's always looking for more money. Is a vital feature of the individual's pattern of life. This is quite clear in his relationship to the indigenous person, the native person, to Friday, who shows up. He's described as clearly not European. This is in chapter 20. This is chapter 14. The color of his skin was not quite black, but very tawny. He's not white. He's dark-skinned, and other natives in America of a bright dun olive color. There is more description of his appearance than of Crusoe's. He slumbered rather than slept. He's not like me. He is not a civilized person. At last, he lays his, I'm just reading through that lower paragraph now. He lays his head flat upon the ground, close to my foot, and sets my other foot upon his head as he had done before. After this, made all the signs of subjection, servitude, and submission imaginable. He willingly becomes his slave. It's done out of gratitude, but it's almost as if the darker race person, the non-European, and none of us would have probably qualified in Defoe's mind as heirs to Robinson Crusoe. He is naturally made submissive. So this is just the natural state of affairs. Slavery is naturalized here. The contractual relationship between them is also a providential one. The contractual relationship is one that is fitting. It's almost as if by this point, with his summer palace, his winter palace, Crusoe is not only king of his island, he is God himself. He is the provider. I called him, he gives him his name. He is allowed, and I teach him to speak to me. I let him know his name should be Friday, and he is his teacher as well. He's his moralist, he teaches about God, and they get going. What also makes this man so servile and so repugnant, this next page, when they go back to the place of the battle from the day before, I saw at the end of that longer paragraph on top, I saw 3 skulls, 5 hands, and the bone of 3 or 4 legs and feet, an abundance of other bodies of other parts of the bodies. Friday, by his signs, made me understand that they brought over 4 prisoners to feast upon, that 3 of them were eaten up, and that he, pointing himself, was the 4th. They are food to each other. Now, this is clearly made to be abominable, repugnant, atavistic, ancient, sort of primitive. And he makes it clear that they should burn this, and that Friday himself still has cannibalistic urges, and that's the middle paragraph. And this is quite different from the civilized Robinson Crusoe. What I want to ask you is ownership of people any less barbaric? To Robinson Crusoe, this is the natural state of affairs as things ought to be. And there's nothing barbaric or primitive about it. Let's finish our conversation for today. Hi, everyone. So we're going to now bring this lesson to its conclusion and try to make some sense of what we've learned in our ongoing, and I know it was today, very packed conversation regarding Robinson Crusoe. This text, despite its tedium, is instructive, influential, and interesting in its own right. It is full of paradoxes. It is about one individual alone in the world who comes to represent his entire nation. It's about the emergence of a new society and class, even as it reflects only, even as it focuses only on one person. And likewise, it is about religion, even as it is about profit and money. How can it all fit together? Well, perhaps one of the starkest contradictions comes on the heels of what we were just talking about regarding slavery and the civilized rationality of owning other people in what becomes a truly horrible organization of society versus the treatment of cannibalism as barbaric. So that's what I was just saying. Crusoe treats Friday's cannibalism as horrible, whereas his subjection of Friday to slavery, the very arrangement that allows for such massive profit of England for the next 100 years plus, is thought to be the most natural, ordinary thing in the world. This contradiction is very starkly and powerfully put in a set of paired passages here. There it is. The following set of shared passages from two thinkers, major writers of British literature, English language literature. One, Samuel Taylor Coleridge on the right side. I'll begin with that. And then James Joyce. Coleridge, of course, himself an Englishman, describes Crusoe as a representative of humanity. The charm of Defoe's works, says Coleridge, especially of Robinson Crusoe, is founded on the same principle. It always interests, never agitates. Crusoe himself is merely a representative of humanity in general. Neither his intellectual nor his moral qualities set him above the middle degree of mankind. His only prominent characteristic is the spirit of enterprise and wandering, which is nevertheless a very common disposition. You'll observe that all that is wonderful in this tale is the result of external circumstance, of things which fortune brings to Crusoe's hand. Coleridge, a thinker and writer we will encounter later in the course, takes Crusoe to be an emblem of universal humanity, a representative of humanity in general, Coleridge writes. There's nothing unique or extraordinary about him. It's what happens to him, fate again, that makes him interesting. He is a representative, a specimen of his society. James Joyce, not an Englishman at all, an Irishman, an Irish national, who knew quite well the heel of the British colonial boot and suffered under British colonial rule, writes not directly in opposition to Coleridge, but he's not writing about Coleridge, but he's writing taking a very different direction. Says that what Coleridge essentially says is universal, common to all men, is distinctly British. This is not a universal, general text of humanity, but it is a forerunner of a certain British narrative. Joyce writes in 1912, almost 100 years after Coleridge had written, the true symbol of the British conquest is Robinson Crusoe, who cast away on a desert island becomes an architect, a carpenter, a knife grinder, an astronomer, a baker, a shipwright, a potter, a saddler, a tailor, a clergyman. He becomes all these things. He becomes society bound up in one person. He's the prototype of the British colonialist. As Friday, the trusty savage who arrives on an unlucky day, is the symbol of the subject races. The whole Anglo-Saxon spirit is in Crusoe. The manly independence, the unconscious cruelty, the persistence, the slow yet efficient intelligence, the sexual apathy. Note that Crusoe has no sexual desire for years upon years by himself. The practical, well-balanced religious piety, the calculating taciturnity. Whoever rereads this simple, moving in the light of subsequent history cannot help but fall under its prophetic spell. This text encapsulates within it so much of what will come to be associated, identified with the British spirit, with Englishism. And so is Robinson Crusoe a representative, as the continental readers took it to be, an emblem of the continental, meaning the European readers, where Robinson Crusoe was wildly popular, more so even than the success that the significant success that the text had in England? Is it a representative, an emblem of natural philosophy, of what happens to man in a natural state of affairs, as people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another figure of enlightenment and a pioneer of what comes to be called romanticism? Or is it distinctly British? Is Crusoe just one individual, or is he a type? Is what happens to Crusoe part of some plot, or is it divine hand? In the last conversation that I'll be sharing with you now, Professor Kohlbrenner talks about the desire to pen one's own story, to write one's own narrative as the constitutive element of the novel. The middle class as trying to free itself from the shackles of religious divine patterns, a divine decree, or royal decrees, to seek one's own, to create one's own story as a kind of natural right. Let's listen to that and then conclude. Okay, so the other question that we're asking with Robinson Crusoe, Professor Kohlbrenner, is how the novel, this art form that was produced by members of the emerging middle station, as it's called, the middle class of English class structure, and it's about their own travails, about their ambitions, their romances, how this text, this bourgeois form, came to supplant the epic as the primary vehicle of literary artistry, as the vessel of moral instruction, and a carrier of meaning. In short, how does the novel condense the big questions of epics into a very humble form? That's the question, how the novel came to inherit the cultural place that had once been occupied by epic.
That's such a beautiful question.
Yeah, we can think about Crusoe as a kind of heir to Odysseus, many of the same questions, but he's such a small man. He's hardly a king. He's a runaway son. So that's the question. This narrative, this trajectory.
Right, it's very interesting to just think about
epic to novel.
See, I when I study the 17th century, I think about the other shift in genre, which is really bigger, from poetry to philosophy. But you're talking about within the literary or within the fictional. I mean, in some ways, you can just think of it in precisely those social forms, that it's a private pleasure. The epic is a genre for the nation, and the novel is a genre for the private person. And he relates to the interiority, to the and the singularity of Defoe. I always, I always in my when was Robinson Crusoe published?
1719.
1719. Wow. I always think of Crusoe as being like an inherited from Milton. That Satan is a character in Milton who wants to break out of the providential frame. Meaning God in Paradise Lost is the author of all things. And there are all sorts of Milton plays with authorship. Adam and Eve are authors to themselves. Of course, they don't deny that God is the author of all things, so it makes things complicated. But Satan, of all the characters, he wants to create a narrative that that is transformative for him. And how is it transformative for him? That it breaks that Christian providential narrative. So I always think of the novel as kind of being an extension of Satan's desire, what he tries to do, which is to write himself, to write his own story. I mean, part of it, he wants to create a narrative that competes with the divine in such a way that they're equivalent. So I always think of Defoe as kind of inheriting that voice, or the possibilities implicit in that voice, which goes back to the story that you and I have been telling for generations now. That goes back through Hamlet and Dr. Faustus, and then back to Augustine, right? I mean, I think for me, Augustine is the starting point of so much.
The desire to fashion the self.
Yeah.
To be the self, as and it goes back to Odysseus. Sorry, not Odysseus, but it goes back to Oedipus, the autochthonous man, a fancy way of saying the self-created person. And the first part of the Oedipus myth is that where do you come from? You come from yourself. He's someone who believes he has no parentage. And that perhaps is it's one of the founding myths of Western society.
I love there are all sorts of Oedipus complexes that have nothing to do with Freud's, right? And they're all good, right?
We are our own parents, and that's also what Robinson Crusoe is doing. He's fleeing his father. I love that idea of the providential, simply because our students who will be listening to this will have read with me, will have read in this class the passages in which Crusoe is confronted by the specter or by the shock that perhaps God is still nonetheless guiding his life with a kind of, that he's still operating within a framework of what Jewish thought calls hashgacha pratit, within the providential framework. And at the same time, he's keeping a journal. He talks about those moments as he's writing his journal, which is the kernel, which is the germ, precisely in passages about germs and kernels and seeds, that the providential rises up out of the ground, out of the terrain, out of the earth of the narrative. And in that journal, which is the kernel of this larger account that Crusoe himself is supposedly offering, the text itself being the product of Crusoe's own mind and hand. And he wants to stamp out, no, it wasn't providential. It was just random chance. I did it in the end. I was the one who sowed those seeds. And that kind of tension between the providential and the arbitrary, chaotic, private, self-directed. It's just what I chose to do.
Milton is interesting as a foil to that, because in Milton you get both, meaning God is the author of all things, and Adam and Eve are authors to themselves. I mean, there Milton is thinking really exactly about what your Defoe is thinking about, which is freedom. But freedom for Adam and Eve is still possible for Milton in that providential context. And it seems that for Defoe, or for that version of Robinson Crusoe, he can't have that. It's either one or the other, the way you're describing it to me.
Yeah. And of course, this freedom occurs in the context of what is essentially incarceration. As he's imprisoned on this island, he can find freedom, he can escape from God's eye, he can become prosperous, but only in a solitary world where he is imprisoned there for decades.
But in a way, you might be describing people who read novels, imprisoned in the corner of their rooms, reading this text to themselves and feeling that same freedom to be, that freedom you have of being alone.
But that goes back to the question. That's an answer to the question. That's who the readers were of this text. People who would never be able to leave their lives. People who were trapped in their lives, but still were wealthy enough. They were not proletariat. They were not poor people, illiterate. They had the time, they had the means, they had the ability to read, but wished to imagine themselves on their own desert island of one. And it was simply through the peephole, the keyhole of the novel. That's what the novel offered them. Some other way of living. Another way that they knew.
We talked about Joseph Addison, who also talks about the pleasures of poetry as being these private, permissible, and socially acceptable forms of pleasure.
Mm-hmm. So that act of fantasy becomes appealing to people who could no longer identify. They knew they weren't Odysseus, but they can imagine that they could be Robinson Crusoe. Good. All right. Thank you.
Very nice. It's great talking to you, Dr. Feldman. We'll be in touch.
Thank you. Okay.
Take care. Bye.
And likewise, I thank Professor Kohlbrenner for sharing his ideas about the text, and specifically for adding some points regarding the secularizing element of these early novels. Professor Kohlbrenner attached that secular, that non-traditional, or at least non-religious impulse to create one's own story with a growing focus on the individual and independence of religious thought. The relative impotence of religion in Daniel Defoe's novels suggests not a lack of belief, not insincerity or faithlessness, but a secularization of his outlook. The drive for money, the subordination of family ties, all takes place in a new secular and imperial mindset, one of empire, that places, and as well as an enlightenment outlook, that places its value, puts a priority on individuals, on exploration, on money as a rational motive, and also on encompassing an entire world, all that humanity can attain within one individual. It's ironic that this text, which serves as a gateway novel towards the panoramic, comprehensive accounts of society that Dr. Glatt referred to, and that we will come to sample later on, and you will come to sample in your subsequent readings, and you're probably familiar with, focuses so much on one individual, an economy, an empire of one, a society of one individual. It seems to suggest that one person can come to create, alone in a natural state of the world, all of these characteristics of English society. Crusoe, as economic man, is a religious man. He sees God's hand in his own profit. He is someone who relates to others in a contractual terms. The only individual shows up becomes his slave. His family allegiance is subordinated to his desire for money. All of this is representative of Crusoe as someone of the middle class whose very habit is in rising, always going up, aspiring for greater wealth. Therefore, these ways of thinking, dominated by Ian Watt's account, as the novel as representative of a new world view that ties together the Enlightenment, the rational, the political situation, the social and cultural situation, gives us a sense of how these characters, who are sometimes disappointing for their lack of psychological depth, are nonetheless important for us to take note of. Dr. Glatt helped us link Robinson Crusoe with some earlier characters with whom we are familiar. Professor Kohlbrenner helped us understand the novel as a successor text to the religious and mythological epics of prior centuries. But it's still in the writing of this. And think back to the inscription, the writing down of the journal as the kernel, as I was saying, Professor, in the conversation with Professor Kohlbrenner, the kernel of this account of the text itself, the text which poses as Robinson Crusoe's own words. but the writing down of the journal as an attempt to master time, to master the world, to create a kind of order on one's life, and how vital that is to us, even in our own times. A desire to become masters of our own story, to say, this life of mine is one that I am choosing to live. The choices are mine. I am my own individual, not shaped from without, but I exert my will on the world that surrounds me. Thank you for sticking with this. I'm very accessible for your questions. I know it was a great deal of information, but we've tied together a literary point with social ideas, with an intellectual history of the time, and we've tried to connect it to some of the larger questions that you've been asking throughout your literary studies. This text is a massive vessel, like that shipwreck behind me. It's the Vasamuset in Stockholm, by the way, an actual shipwreck that serves as a vessel, a carrier of meaning that, though far away and perhaps submerged under distant waters, still carries us, still has value and meaning for our lives in our time. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next class.